Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you just joining us. It's wonderful to be with you virtually in this conversation we're going to have this morning on how it is that education and climate change are related. My name is Fernando Reimers. I'm a professor of international education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I am delighted to be joined by two colleagues this morning. Margaret Wang Agania, the co-founder and CEO of Subject to Climate, and my co-author in this recent book, Education for a Climate Change Future, which we've been working on for the last several years and which was published just about a month ago, and with Faith Abiodun, who is the CEO or the president of the United World Colleges. And so welcome, Margaret, and welcome, Faith. I'm going to pass it over to you so that you can introduce yourselves before we dive in.
Thank you so much, Fernando. I think you did a great job introducing myself, but I'll give just a one sentence of what Subject to Climate is as it relates to the book we wrote. So I co-founded and run a nonprofit called Subject to Climate, and we have a free online resource for all educators K through 12, all grade levels and subjects to integrate climate action into what they already teach. And also was a former student of Fernando, so I'm really excited to be here and talk about such an important topic. I'll go ahead and pass it to Faith.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Faith. As Fernando has mentioned, I have the privilege of leading the United World Colleges. We're a global education movement. We have a footprint in about 155 countries around the world, and there are 18 international schools across Asia, Europe, the Americas, and Africa. And we work with young people from very young ages all the way up until the end of high school. And sustainability, climate action is very much at the core of part of the work that we do. So it's brilliant to have a chance to be in conversation with Fernando and Margaret.
Margaret, why don't you lead us into how this is going to run?
Yeah, so this is set up as a Zoom webinar, and so you can write in the chat, but there's also a Q&A function as well on your menu so that at the end we will be going through questions, but I know that people have submitted questions as well, so we'll be trying to address those questions throughout, and if we don't get to them, at the very end of the talk, we'll have an open Q&A. The chat is also open. We encourage you all to react, share. We're looking at them as well, so we'll be reacting real life time. And we are recording this, and then we'll be sharing it out with those who have registered. Just a reminder, the last thing I'll say is that Fernando showed the book, and we'll be talking mostly about the book and the applications of this through Faith's experience with United World College. But I'm just going to put in the chat that this book is open access and free to download. And so we encourage you, if you have not read it, we'll be talking about it, giving you an overview about it and the applications of it. But we really encourage you because it's accessible and open access. And so that's the logistics of what we're going to go through. Yeah, thanks, Fernando.
Well, thank you. So let me just, as we dive in, share a little bit the intent of this book and the overall structure. Our goal in writing this book was to, on the one hand, take stock about what is known, about how it is that education and climate relate to each other. And on the other hand, our goal was also to offer a framework that could be useful to a range of people interested in this relationship. People like Faith, who lead education movements that are interested in offering high quality education, people who lead schools, people who teach in schools, government leaders, people who work in non-governmental organizations, such as Margaret, Subject to Climate, who support schools. And what we offer, what we argue in the book is that it is essentially to understand this relationship as a relationship between two systems. Climate is a complex system, education is a complex system. And these systems are in interaction with each other. They're each cause at the same time an effect of the other one. And what the book tries to do then is to unpack what that means, to be two systems in interaction. The book then takes the question of how is it that, on the one hand, how is it that climate is impacting opportunity to learn? And we review and synthesize the existing evidence on the many and multifaceted impacts that extreme heating, floods are having on opportunity to learn for children around the world. On the other hand, the book then says, how is it that education systems are responding to these challenges of climate? What is it that schools could do that would help young people develop skills, develop dispositions to understand, care about, and be able to adapt, mitigate, and perhaps revert climate change? And again, we examine the existing evidence on that, and we organize this evidence in terms of what governments do, hierarchical organizations, the efforts of governments in advancing policies to address, the efforts of transnational organizations that work with policies, but also the efforts of organizations of civil society, uh, schools themselves, networks of schools, organizations that support to schools, both national as well as transnational. So that's what the book does. We put forth this notion that in this relationship, there are first and second order effects on climate. First order effects, the effect of climate on education. Second order, the reverse. And the basic argument of the book is that piecemeal interventions to address this relationship are inadequate, that we do need a systemic conception of how it is that we can develop a better way for schools to respond to the impacts of climate change and to prepare students to actually do something about it. And with that, let me turn it over to Margaret, I think.
Well, yes, Fernando, we do talk about the first order and second order, and I wanted to bring this into like the practitioner lens and actually think about United World College and bring faith into the conversation. So we know that UWC operates across multiple countries and students come from over 150 nations. And so as Fernando mentioned, we talk about first order effects, climate disrupting education. So the first question, I actually have three questions for Faith, but we'll start with one of the questions is, Faith, when you look at how climate change is already disrupting schools and communities your students are coming from, so the first order effects that we talk about in this book, how important is addressing climate change in the UWC curriculum, so the second order effect? Would love to hear your experiences. And so, in other words, in what ways is UWC educating students to understand climate change? So I'll pass it to you, Faith.
Brilliant. And thanks to both of you for the great work you've done in writing this book. And it contributes a lot to our knowledge and understanding around the world in which we're living in and how climate and education come into one. You've mentioned already we have students who are coming in from more than 150 countries around the world. So it means that inevitably there are people with lived experiences of some of the worst impacts of climate change today. We have students coming from the Marshall Islands, for example, in the Pacific, one of the parts of the world that we know will probably be the first to go underwater if any of the predictions that we have about, the future of our planet, if any of these things really do come to life. We have students who are coming in from parts of Africa, in Sudan and South Sudan and Tanzania, parts of Kenya, where droughts and famines have begun to really impact livelihoods. And we have people coming into our schools from even the United States, Japan, parts of Europe, where we've seen some of the worst impacts of, extreme climate events over recent years. So it doesn't matter when the world people come from, it's very likely they've had some kind of encounter with some of the worst impacts of the climate. The mission of the United World College movement is to unite people, nations, and cultures for peace and a sustainable future. When we think about what a sustainable future means, having a healthy planet is one of the ways in which we can enable a sustainable future. So our goal is to bring people together to work towards a sustainable future. Therefore, we've got to educate people to understand the current realities, get a sense of the historical perspective as well of how we've come to be where we are. We have to think about the economics of climate change as much as we understand the science of climate change. And through all of this, ultimately want to inspire people to be capable and willing to take actions in the course of shaping a more sustainable future. So to ground this first part of the conversation is to say this is absolutely important for us because it's at the heart of our mission. And how we go about doing that comes in different phases. There is the work we do in the classroom. There is work we do outside of the classroom. A lot of student projects, A lot of joint action comes into this as well, and lots of practical work that happens even beyond a person's time in a UWC school. In the course of the conversation, I'll draw different examples from some of our schools in different parts of the world, where we can see some specific curriculum interventions, where we can see some student projects, where we can see all kinds of entrepreneurial approaches that our schools are taking, as far as building construction, as far as human interaction with the environment, as far as partner with local communities, and even in places like Canada, where there's a lot of indigenous work going on with the ancient peoples who have lived in those parts of the world. There's a lot of evidence we can draw from this network that shows in practice, what a collective effort towards educating for a healthier planet can mean for us. So I'll pause at this level just to give a sense of what's to come in the course of the conversation, but there's a lot of richness that we can draw from what we're seeing in our practice today.
And Faith, just to add on to that, it's really great to understand how you and UWC is viewing how important teaching about climate change is, especially the impacts that has on your students and even the schools that you operate out of. And just at high level, because we'll talk about this throughout the webinar, what do you see is working in terms of educating students to understand climate change? And what questions do you feel like you still need to be answers about the existing approaches to climate change education?
It's a fantastic question, Margaret. I think every time we think about how people learn best, teaching at people is perhaps the least effective way of enabling learning. Engaging in some kind of practice tends to be more effective. And so a lot of the work we do is getting people real hands-on. There's always a science or curriculum backing to what we do, but more importantly, we're all about getting people out there, and then the real learning happens in the reflection post the doing. So a lot of our approaches begin with some kind of curriculum-based learning, then very quickly getting people out there to try things, and that's student projects, that's school partnerships, that's lots of involving people from the youngest ages of 4 in some of our schools, showing people the data dashboards of how we're tracking things and inviting them to reflect, etc. Then we do a lot of getting people out into their own communities to begin to develop interventions and then coming back to give their reflections of what they have learned. So somewhere in that combination of practice and reflection is where we're seeing the best learnings of what's working. But ultimately, I think I'm zoom to the point around the questions that remain unanswered or areas of further work. I think it's the gap between the awareness of the path of the planet as we're going on, as well as the micro and macro interventions that make a difference. Many years ago now, people began to settle around recycling as the way to contribute in their own way to helping shape a better planet. But eventually, the fatigue that emerges from doing individual recycling or family recycling or even school recycling, you begin to wonder, does this really make a difference at scale? What do we do with, governmental policies? What do we do with the big oil polluting companies? What do we do with all of those? So people, I think, are navigating this gap between individual action and collective action, and whether or not we really can turn the tide. So there remain lots of questions for us. And to come into some specifics, even in our schools, we have a wonderful school in Germany, in the city of Freiburg, which is on the back of a forest, and they do a lot of practical conservation work as a school, both what they teach and they're having a green farm that students walk on, and they track their own footprint every single year in terms of distance traveled by miles, and food consumption, energy consumption, etc. A lot of tracking happens. And then the attempt that school takes within our network is to do the carbon offsetting by partnering with a foundation in Morocco to plant fruits and nut trees. But when you do that, you ask yourself, have we gone far enough? Have we done our best? Because you're looking at what are the options that we have available to us that really can turn the tide of what we're seeing as a planet. So I think we still have those questions about, once we've done, Fridays for Future strikes, once we have, organized, climate conscious campaigns, once we've driven e-vehicles and done all of those things, can we really turn the tide, or is it too late? So there are a couple of questions that remain for us, but we will keep doing what we have in our capacity to do.
Let me turn to you, Margaret. In the book, we talk, when we review the existing scholarship on how education can address climate. We talk about 5 different narratives. Can you talk about them and what you see are the implications for practitioners of these different perspectives to think about this relationship?
Right. So we do talk about 5 existing narratives about what climate education should be. And when Faith was talking, I heard a lot of it as well. And we also asked a lot of our participants during the webinar registration, or we emailed you all asking you, what do you think? What does climate education mean to you? And so I see a lot of these coexisting narratives, meaning that they are existent and they have permeated into our everyday speak because I hear it in your responses. The first one is climate literacy. This foundation, I think this is the most popular one where knowing is empowering. We see a lot of countries really looking at the scientific understanding of climate systems, causes, and impacts. And because that has been a predominant lens of climate education, that's why climate change typically sits in the science subjects. It typically sits in when you're talking about earth systems or earth sciences. And we see that because when we asked you the question of what does climate education mean to you, there are a couple of responses that said climate science understanding. It is literally learning what is climate change, the scientific underpinnings of that. And then, and this is really important, some of you all pointed out foundational awareness and basic knowledge. For some, simply knowing about the climate or awareness and the main meaning of what does it mean scientifically is really important. And that has been the predominant narrative. And we see that, for example, there is in the US, there is the US Global Change Research Program's climate literacy. They created the essential principles of climate science. And CLEAN is an organization that specifically defines what climate literacy is, knowing core concepts like greenhouse effect, carbon cycle, feedback loops, understanding graphs, hypothesis testing, and all of those. So climate literacy is one narrative. The second narrative is what Faith was talking about when you had questions about. And then there's the moving from knowing to doing. So the second narrative is education for climate action, because it's one thing to know what climate change is, but it's another to then know what are the active levers for mitigation, adaptation, and climate reversal, frankly. And so there is that additional lens that is added to climate literacy. And so many countries see education as a way to catalyze collective action. And that's again what Faith was talking about, the remaining questions. Can we move that literacy to action? And some of the principles within Education for Climate Action look at, okay, let's make it personally relevant and link it to everyday issues. Let's look at local problems and citizen science projects. Let's cultivate self-efficacy and agency and really engage in school and community projects. Now, the third lens, you'll see they're not just clean frameworks, they do overlap a little bit. The other one is education for the green economy, skills for a sustainable future. We know that for the green transition, we need technical competencies as well to fill in the jobs that are needed for us to make this green transition. So there is that lens as well, the workforce development lens. One of my favorite lenses to look at is actually through, Christina Kwok has a really great lens of how to think about this. So she looks at, okay, here are the skills that you need, those specific skills that you need for the jobs. But then there's this second lens of here are the cross-cutting, skills that you'll need, the critical thinking. But then she actually makes it more complex and brings it to another level of here are the skills that we really need for a just transition, which leads into the other lens of critical and decolonial approaches, where you really observe who bears the cost of climate change, whose knowledge counts, and how power shapes this crisis, and how we can leverage indigenous knowledge and to help us reverse climate change. The last one that I didn't mention is this holistic viewpoint of education for sustainable development. And this is, you see this and hear this a lot through UN, UNESCO, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. But this places climate change education within the broader scope of sustainable development. How do we live sustainably as within the planetary bounds? And this is where, again, a lot of you all put this as well. This is why it's cross-cutting. It's not just in science. It should be woven through curricula and not a standalone subject, and very much related to systems thinking, as well as what I had mentioned for education for climate action, active participatory learning. So these five are the existing lenses. And again, they're not just clean cut, they all have interlinkages.
And I think understanding the relationship between climate and education is not about picking one of those narratives. It's about understanding all of them and being able to go back from all of them in different contexts. For example, if you are a government, you may find that there are constraints to engaging with the perspectives that are more about social justice, that engage with issues of responsibilities and so on, but that it is possible to engage with sustainability or to engage with climate science. So I think that what this multi-perspectival approach offers is the versatility to be able to find a point of entry, whatever context you're in, whether that's a school, a community, or a nation. Let's move along and then talk now, move to the, I think you are going to ask some questions of Faith, Margaret. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yes, Fernanda, just to comment on what you said about these narratives being coexisting, there is a framework that we use throughout the book from Shu Hung Chang. It's and how we kind of combine and leverage all of them. It gives you like a way to do that. And it's knowing, doing, and being. And again, knowing includes the climate literacy aspect of it. Doing includes the education for climate action and even really, the green skills lens, and being, it's the values, the identity, and the civic agency. And so, you know, it is useful to have these coexisting five narratives of what climate education should be, but really it's what I think the power it brings is the combination of all of them. And I like the knowing, doing, being. It's a really simplistic way of synthesizing it. And so, it's one thing to talk about these different coexisting narratives, but Faith is our practitioner right now in UWC. So after hearing these narratives, what are you seeing in schools across UWC's network? Which of these narratives resonate most, and which one do you think is missing?
This is great, and I appreciated seeing that section in your book actually in drawing this different components out. To be honest, I can see all of them in practice in our schools, and I talked about being able to see this at even younger ages. There are 18 schools in the UWC network, and four of our schools begin from kindergarten. On my very first visit to our school in Singapore, I had a chance to engage with a group of them. They couldn't have more than 7 or 8-year-old students, right, who were involved in managing a part of a school farm, a grain farm. And I met another group of students who were in the office with, the head of campus sustainability, where behind a massive dashboard of different screens tracking carbon emissions and water usage and electricity usage and all of that. And these were young children, right? So the beginnings of the conversation starts with those young children. The very same gentleman who's head of campus sustainability was talking to me about how when parents come to pick the kids from school, every now and then they have the tendency to keep the engine running while they wait for the kids to come in. And so there's a lot of signs and guidance going to parents that turn off the vehicle engine and stop your emissions, while you wait for your kids to come through school. So the parent education and child education at a very young level, that's all awareness, right? You're building the basic understanding that even micro actions can contribute towards macro challenges. But then you scale further up to look at what really sits in the curriculum, and how do we take that curriculum within the classroom and beyond the classroom. For example, we have a program called the Climate Action Leadership Diploma that we run in our school in Canada. This is off the coast of British Columbia, a place called Victoria. Now, this is a program within the IB's careers related program, the International Baccalaureate. And so it's a certified, way of study at the secondary level. And they've also partnered with three universities actually in Canada. They partner with Royal Roads University, they partner with Vancouver Island University and Camerson College. So students are able to get, 12 transferable university credits alongside their high school diploma, which also means that a lot of the content is coming through from the universities. You've got courses in climate science and environmental policy, in the concrete economics of green transitions, right? So this is a lot of deep learning. But what I find most valuable personally in that learning is the stewardship that goes with the learning. In our earlier conversation, Fernando, I mentioned the fact that our college took responsibility in 1997 for a place called Race Rocks. This is an ecological reserve off the coast of the Pacific Ocean, and it's got the second oldest lighthouse on the Canadian West Coast. It's been around since the 1800s, since about 1860. And so the Canadian government, automated this lighthouse in 1997, and our school took over the management of the station and the neighboring Race Rocks Reserve. What that means is that we're responsible for, measuring ocean temperature, our students and our teachers every single day. And this has been going on since 1921. We took responsibility for this in 1997. But it means that we are tracking the ocean temperature in that part of the world all year round. We're tracking the salinity in the water all year round. It means that we're restoring kelp that's in the water, and that's obviously useful for oxygen levels in the water. We're responsible for the California sea lions that migrate to this part of the world on a cycle every year. So there's a lot of. I went on a sea boat with students and with the head of biology, to spend time on the water about an hour. You're not learning the theory of climate action. You're actually measuring how ocean temperature changes from day to day as part of practical action. You see the sea lions that you're responsible for looking after every single day. And all the way through that, there's also deep relationship with the Shianu First Nation that's responsible, that's been on this territory going back 500 plus years. And these people bring in their indigenous knowledge to help our people understand how they have kept this part of the world safe before, what we think about as Western intervention or the scientific perspective that we bring in. We weave a lot of indigenous resource management systems and this traditional ecological knowledge along with what you think about as just modern marine science. And to be doing that with a new generation of students from all parts of the world. That's a snippet of what it's like to go beyond the classroom. Of course, you're learning the biology, you're learning the science of how this is working. You're involved in replanting kelp in the Pacific Ocean. You're involved in protecting the space where sea lions migrate year in, year out. You're responsible for tracking the ocean temperature. And you are also engaging with local communities. I did see in the chat, someone was asking, how do we integrate indigenous practices? It is by respect. It is by engaging with those who have been there long before we came in, and extracting, working with them to understand what is transferable knowledge that can be applied in other parts of the world. There are lots of other examples as well that I can share. In practice, our school in Wales, UWC Atlantic, also began to develop a program called the Systems Transformation Pathway. It's now spread also to a school in Singapore and a few other schools around the world. The question was, how do we prepare students today to grapple with some of the most complex global challenges confronting us, every one of which is linked to climate? Question is, how do we feed 8 billion people on a planet that's continually warming itself up? It will impact agriculture. How do we restore and protect the biodiversity of our ecosystems? How do we transition safely from polluting energy sources in a way that's quick and equitable? How do we respond to the mass displacement and migrations that evolve as a result of conflict and climate? And how do we protect our water sources? You have students who are engaging with this, not just from physics or science or economics, but thinking practically. These are big questions, and not a single one of us can solve them on our own. But by holding the space within the academic program for young people to dig deep into these questions, real transdisciplinary inquiry. And young people are spending time in the classroom with experts they're having the chance to design projects which they then implement at home in their home countries and also partly in their school in Wales. And then they have a chance to develop good reflections that come out of that, highly action oriented. And so these are examples of how you take young people into that education for climate action and then begin to stimulate real indigenous practices as well alongside what they're doing. We are seeing the results of this, certified by universities. Cambridge has just finished the first study on the school, on the work we're doing in Wales. So it's a way to say that you can go across the five spectrums, horizons of the spectrum, begin with that literacy and begin to move into some kind of action and then loop it with the education for sustainable development, because what we're doing here links to livelihoods, it links to jobs, it links to the health of our planet as a whole. And we are just privileged to be able to incubate this learning for the benefit of the rest of the world.
And just a quick follow-up question onto that, just to build onto it. You brought a lot of the different perspectives. One of the perspectives that is gaining a lot of traction right now is the workforce development. And I heard notes of that in your conversation. You talked about jobs, talked about something that like something with career, because at that that is something very much on the minds of a lot of people who are in schools. They're thinking about what's my next job. Of course, it's important for your livelihood planet, but sometimes when you're a student and a parent, you're thinking about how's this going to get my kid a job. And so I'm curious if you could share that perspective a little bit more. And, if you think that perspective is too narrow though, or yeah.
Yeah, it's a good prompt to have. I think, of course, there's a lot of focus on the future of work in many ways. But in particular, I think the narrative of the green economy has been kind of taking root in recent times. I think this generation that we are seeing is one of the most conscious generations that we've seen for a while. Of course, every generation has its own wave of consciousness, but we're working with a generation right now that's learning to kind of vote in a way where their choices are reflecting the values that they claim to hold. And many other people are prompting young people to begin their careers in areas that are most proximal to the issues that matter the most to them. Because if you're going to make a difference, you want to spend the early part of your career being close to the things that matter to you. So it's not narrow at all. I think, of course, the narrow part might be if we simply, throw around the language of the green economy and nothing else and green jobs, it might become a little bit naive. But what we are saying is the nature of work itself is changing. And it feels quite motivating for people to want to do some work close to the climate, whether it's climate advocacy that people want to join organizations that work for that. And we have people who begin their jobs perhaps in the finance sector and very quickly decide that's not for them. They want to go work on climate finance specifically. Or you have people who want to work on climate advocacy or people who want to work on, climate solutions locally. So we are seeing a wave of consciousness, I think, that's driving people to interrogate how their own personal choices and their career choices can contribute towards rather than diminish the health of the planet. And that very much feels the way we are working within UWC. I hired a chief of staff, for example, 3 years ago, who spent 1 year with me and was very clear, I want to go work on climate advocacy as my next job. So those things make me feel quite happy that people are interested in pursuing ways in which their careers can contribute towards the planet. What we need to do collectively is to continue to make the case for the ways in which the integration happens a bit more seamlessly, so we don't keep it siloed. Otherwise, it feels demotivating for others whose jobs might not lead them initially towards a climate conscious path. So the integration will really help our continued education of what we're doing.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to comment on that. Like, one thing that in our chapter with the 5 existing narratives, we actually do bring in AI because I saw in the chat somebody said, well, do you see AI as a help or hindrance combination? It is, we didn't have, right now when we were writing the book, there wasn't enough out there for us to make a comment of that this is a existing climate change education lens, but we believe it should be a lens. And in the question of is AI a help or hindrance, there needs to be a combination of both with that lens because we are leveraging a lot of resources and inequitably as well. But at the same time, I think the misconception is AI is just ChatGPT or, chatbots, but AI and machine learning can be a very important tool to leverage for climate solutions. I'm putting in the chat an amazing scholar named Priya Danti at MIT that has written, for a long time. Here are the highest leverage points machine learning and AI can be leveraged for climate solutions. So we talk about that a little bit in the five narratives because with careers, people are thinking about AI. But what we argue is that, it's part of future skills, AI, but then sustainability is so that we leverage AI not just for, using our Earth's resources and how can we do it to be more mindful of the resources that we use, but also for solutions. Fernando, before we move to the next section, I'd love to invite you to comment on anything that you've heard.
Yeah, let me comment on this hierarchy that Faith presented when he organized the five narratives, almost as a Bloom's hierarchy of knowledge, which I think is very sound, at the base of which is knowledge, understanding that knowledge alone is not enough, but it is indispensable. I think it's important to talk about how these narratives connect and how these developmental trajectories for students might look like. If I understood you, Faith, you said, look, everybody can begin where they are with actions that may be small, but a small action leads to greater efficacy, to a bigger action, to a bigger action. I think that's really important. In the book, we cite evidence that there isn't always adequate knowledge, not only about climate and its causes, but about the possible solutions. We cite a survey that was administered to representative samples of adults in about 24 countries, in which people were asked, how much do you care about climate? And for the most part, there is a lot of caring about climate. But then they were asked to choose what are some of the highest leverage points to address climate. And they picked the wrong ones. Most people pick recycling their trash, which is, of course, a good thing. But I think the last option that they chose was having fewer children, which is potentially one of the highest leverage points to impact climate. And so I think we cannot underscore the importance of knowledge enough. At the same time, it's clear that knowledge alone may not need to action or to the dispositions to ask. In fact, knowledge alone can be so overwhelming that people don't see themselves in the picture, which is why the action-based pedagogies that Faith was talking about are so important, because they draw on what we know about how we build efficacy among young people. And that is basically working in the zone of proximal development, giving people experiences that allow them to succeed, to gain some feedback, and then to try something more challenging. So I wanted to talk about that importance. I think that sometimes people approach the topic of climate when they ask, what is it that we should engage our students? They say, well, let's get them to be activists. Well, there is room for the activist, of course, but there is also room for the person who decides to work on cleaner nuclear energy. If we're going to move away from carbon-based energies, which is a hugely important issue, we're going to need more than activism. We're going to need scientists and engineers. Faith shared a wonderful example of a former student in the United World College who basically went on and made a career choice. And I wonder if you would comment on that from
Yeah.
my point of view seems hugely consequential and the kind of example of what effective education actually is.
Thank you for that, Fernando. I think it was huge inspiration for me as well. This is a young woman who went to our school in India called the Mahindra United World College, and she commented that in the course of her education there, she got very interested in what pathways she might be able to take. And that school, of course, sits on 71 hectares of land and is highly involved in conservation efforts, tracking, human, plant and animal life. But having come out of that school, she latched onto the shipping industry. The name of this young woman is Alicia Fredrickson. And she focused on the shipping industry as one that is one of the biggest polluters of the world, but also one of the biggest contributors to our shared livelihood. We know what's happened in the Middle East. Once you stop shipping, economies begin to slowly shrink. So we need the shipping industry for what it does for us today, but at the same time, it's one of the biggest polluters in the world. And so the solution that her company is called Seabound, Seabound, And the solution that they began to work on was to invent a device that can be attached to the exhaust of a ship, and it tracks the carbon that a ship would otherwise emit out into the environment, into the water or into the air. It captures the carbon and stores it for the course of the ship's journey. And at the point of docking, they extract all of that carbon, they convert that into limestone, which is then used for building, right? So it's a circular, part of the circular economy in itself. You prevent the thing from going out into the environment, but you also contribute towards building constructions in the world. And I've been able to look at the website of the work that Seabound is doing. They're really capturing tons of carbon across the world, and their target rate is to capture between 25 and 69% of the carbon that will otherwise get emitted into the water. And we had a webinar with Alicia and a few other speakers on Earth Day, 24th of April, 22nd of April this year. It was a great expose of how education leads to action straight away. A person comes into an environment where they become conscious of the importance of individual and collective action. They then engage in learning, further learning about what kinds of solutions might contribute at some scale to making a difference. They build the entrepreneurial capacity to begin to do something about what they've just learned. They raise the funds for it, they get to work. There's a journey. Many people stop at the point of awareness. It's great to know that this is a big challenge in the world. I'm happy someone else is going to fix it. If I cannot recycle my food, right? But you don't go that next step. And what gives me pride is that we're able to build communities of people who can be inspired by those kinds of action and say, look, it's my turn. I want to pursue this. And that's the point I was making earlier about people beginning their careers in the areas that are proximal to the issues that most bother them. And so if there are young people who are very concerned about the future of our planet, there are spaces where they can actually kick in, begin their careers working right next to people who've begun to take those kinds of actions. The inspiration courses through them, and then we can see many more of these kinds of solutions in the world. So I'm very proud of this first levels of intervention. I'll put the link in the chat for Seabound so more people can see for themselves what an example looks like of what entrepreneurial actions can lead towards. And hopefully many more people look at this and think, well, I got to find my own way to do something similar as well. That's the ripple of change.
Well, thank you so much, Faith. I see a lot of chat questions in a chat and also questions that have come up on like, okay, well, what do we need to do? How do we do what Faith is doing with all the UW schools? But I want to take a step back to on the next section we're going to talk about is that before you can even answer what should we be doing, we need to understand what the evidence shows right now. So in one of our chapters, we actually present evidence from global assessments like PISA, TIMSS, ICCS on, okay, well, where are students at right now? Because until we get an argument is like, until you know that, it's hard to plan an intervention. And this actually addresses a couple of questions that you all also submitted. There were questions on like what evidence exists for about climate change, attitudes, behaviors, and outcomes, how to measure its effectiveness. A lot of these tests and assessments have that foundation. So before we get into it, we also want to go over what climate literacy is, because remember, there's all these coexisting frameworks. When we looked at what students actually know in terms of climate literacy, we didn't just look at climate-specific knowledge. We looked also at foundational knowledge and systems thinking, so the cross-cutting skills that you need to even understand climate change. We looked at climate change knowledge. We looked at attitudes and values and disposition to act. So I'm trying to make it a little bit more nuanced and complicated because when you hear what do students know, you're probably thinking through one of the lenses, which is climate literacy. But we looked at these global assessments, and I wanted to share an overview of what we saw. These assessments show that, and this is what Fernando had mentioned, that students really care and are concerned about climate change, and they believe climate change is important, very motivated. But climate knowledge generally has not improved over the past decade. What's also really interesting is that knowledge levels vary dramatically across countries, and they have So the bottom line is they're very environmentally enthusiastic, but not deeply climate literate. So when we think about it, what is action and activism without knowledge? That gives the example that Fernando mentioned, where students will do maybe the least effective climate solutions. But when we look about what do students know that climate change is happening. The majority of students believe that human activities contribute to it. They understand temperatures are rising. They seem to have better understanding of the impacts, but not so much the causes and solutions. And it seems like they recognize the impacts because they recognize the visible impacts. And that makes a lot of sense. If you see and feel the rising temperatures, you understand those impacts. But what they really struggle with is why is it happening? How do these climate systems work? What's the connection between climate, health, food, migration, and economics, and the hard science behind it? So some common misconceptions that students have is they confuse climate change with ozone depletion. They believe that ozone holes cause warming. They confuse weather and climate. They equate climate change to general pollution. And so these are the types of common misconceptions. So that's the overview of the knowledge part. And I'll share a little bit about the attitude action part, which is really interesting. So I mentioned that there is a high concern, but the action is limited. So as I mentioned, most students view climate change as a serious threat, but about half believe protecting the environment is an important civic responsibility, and a small minority actually participate in sustained collective action, which is hard because we know that climate solutions require not just individual actions, those are necessary but not sufficient. They require collective action. And students tend to favor easy actions. So young people tend to adopt low-cost behaviors, recycling, unplugging appliances, planting trees, which are all great. Don't get me wrong, they are great. But when it comes to systems level solutions, the ones that require maybe more complex skills, such as political advocacy, collective action, changing their own consumptions and transportations, that's what students are not doing as much. But knowledge actually influences that. The more they understand what are the causes, the more they understand what are very, effective solutions, and the more that they know what are effective solutions, the more they can act on it. So I wanted to share that as a baseline of what our evidence actually shows about where students are at. And so, Faith, hearing that, what surprises you? Is that consistent to what you're seeing? Yeah.
I mean, this is where it gets interesting. I think there's a generational shift in climate awareness, and maybe we're still teaching the way we began to teach this, 3, 4 decades ago, which is just throw more facts at people. The more facts we gave them, the more they would believe it. And I think we've reached a point where more facts don't equate to more likelihood of action. That there was a time when that was necessary. I think people are generally aware of the path of our environment. And the question is to that, attitude gap, what happens now? Right. So yes, we are seeing, the desire for those micro actions to turn off the lights and plant a couple of trees. And we do that at some scale in our schools as well. We've got lots of active work. When I went to a school in Thailand, I engaged with mangrove reforestation. The students would go and collect pods every week from the beach cleanups. They nurture these seedlings in a little nursery. They replant them along the coastline in Phuket. That's wonderful. That's for young kids. Well, what's the equivalent action for people in their 20s? What's the equivalent for people in their 30s? Right? So the micro actions are still there, but I think that sense of agency is where something needs to happen. What is the scale? You do highlight, I think, in the book, the things that make the most difference, right? It's important for people to still feel encouraged to take those small actions, but at some point, we need them to engage in more of the advocacy at the public level. That's the hard part. And we're seeing the complexity of political systems where climate is now not political neutral. Climate advocacy is now embedded into political ideology. And so it becomes a bit too politicized for common sense to pass through. And we're seeing that, I mean, all of those reflect in our own communities as well. I think the point around someone in the chat talked about, we began very conscious about, what became, publicly known as climate anxiety, right? Where people become overwhelmed with the concerns about the environment that they're paralyzed in terms of their actions and what their own agency looks like. Those are extremes, right? So we want to guide people away from climate illiteracy, but also guide them away from climate anxiety. And somewhere in the middle, agency grows through action, right? The more you do, the more you feel you can contribute. And so people are waiting for that spark that activates their agency. And I'm saying the spark lies in the micro actions that you're already taking. The micro actions can then lead to collective action. And so the ways in which we are guiding people from the edges towards the center is by getting them practically involved, right? In the Q&A, you might have seen the question there from my colleague Ivind in our school in Singapore, who's kind of asking the fact that young people come into our educational spaces wanting to do something, but having been educated in a different way, they're not prepared to activate that agency. Something's got to change in the foundational ways of learning. And I think a lot of what needs to change is the early engagement in the agency, in the agency activating work. How do we get young people to begin to believe that they can do something that contributes? It's the thinking. The goal of our systems transformation pathway is to get people before others trust them to engage in systems level thinking, get them to start to do the work, to recognize that there are interrelated things, that the economics and the politics of these things are interwoven, and that action requires working with people. It requires real systems level thinking. It requires practice. So we're beginning to do that, but we know it's not yet working at scale in many of the educational institutions. So our goal is to showcase what is possible and through that invite more people to redesign their own approaches to learning. To say, for example, if we're going to address sustainable food across the world, you have to think about soil. You have to think about water supply and sunlight. You have to think about air. You have to think about all of these things. You have to think about locations, water sources. So rather than teaching those things in siloed subjects, you have to teach them collectively. So for example, in our school, you have 5 teachers co-teaching the systems transformation pathway at our school in Wales. They're coming at different angles of the same conversation. So a young person slows down. You're not just running into, well, this is the one way of thinking about it. You have a lot of co-teaching happening, and then you have practice, and then you have reflection. So the combination of these things can shift what we are seeing, but there's a lot that has to happen in the world of education generally to make this a bit more sustainable as a way of teaching.
And I know in the third section or the last section, Fernando is really going to go into like the systems changes that need to happen, which is actually a lot of the questions that were submitted. Before we get to it, I wanted to point to something Faith had mentioned. He talked a lot about what needs to happen, and there are a lot of questions that were like that were submitted that was like, well, how do we teach it? What practical tips on how to teach about climate change, your questions on how to teach it in an interactive way, how to motivate people. The great thing is in our chapter that we talk about, hey, here's evidence on what students know. And here's a literature review of what has worked in the past, because we don't need to start from scratch. There is evidence out there on what tends to work. And so I'll go over that real quickly because I think that having something that's based on evidence can be really powerful to set the strategies on how to enact effective climate education. And so one of the things it's really cool because it actually relates to the evidence of what students know. So it goes back to the knowing, being, doing framework. So everything in the book is kind of linked. So when we did a literature review, we did still see that the knowing is so important, that there needs to be strong scientific foundations, and that matters. So research shows that effective instructions for that includes explicitly teaching the foundational concepts. Number 2 is if you know the misconceptions, the ones that we just listed that students have misconceptions about, the best ways to fight against the misconceptions is to directly name them and to directly teach about how did those misconceptions come about? This relates to how do you navigate systematic disinformation, head on addressing the disinformation, bringing it into classroom. It helps with media literacy, which is already what we're teaching in schools. But I think sometimes the easiest answer is actually just directly addressing it. So if with this book, I'm hoping that you go through that chapter of what are the common misconceptions, integrate that directly into your curriculum. There's also the second thing that is really interesting is duration. Longer programs produce deeper changes, but do not underestimate the effects of short interventions. We've seen in literature that short interventions can actually spark curiosity, which could be the foundation for students to then go learn things on their own. It actually increases behavioral intentions and encourages simple actions. So if you know, do not underestimate that. Outside of the book, my organization just did a 2-year study on the effects of one unit. And we saw massive changes in knowledge, attitudes, and actually behavior as well. So short interventions can work, but longer programs are more likely to build that durable knowledge and also support not just the personal climate action, but systematic climate action and civic engagement or participation. The last thing that I'll quickly go over on what helps and what the literature shows on what helps is that it's really important for engagement. We hear that with what Faith is sharing. They're doing things. So, one, making it personally relevant. That's why, make sure when they learn about climate change, it's connected to their local communities, future scenarios of the community, and that personal relevance helps them make climate not something so distant in time and space. Active participatory learning is definitely what we heard Faith talk a lot about. So that can include hands-on activities, games and simulations, inquiry-based learning, and lots of multimedia experiences. The last thing is that learning should lead to action. So incorporating community projects, presentation to stakeholders, project-based learning, school sustainability initiatives. We've seen that because climate change is a real world problem, interdisciplinary approaches are very powerful. So subjects like science, civics, English, art, social studies can all contribute to climate learning because climate is not just a science topic. We talked a lot about collective action. And at the end of the webinar, I'll put a link to subject to climate because that's exactly what we do. How do you incorporate it across all subjects and grade levels? So that's just a hint of how you can, what evidence shows on what can work for both knowledge, attitude, and action. And I guess I would invite Fernando or Faith to respond to any of that. Yeah.
Just very quickly, when I think about competency in the domain of climate and in any other competency, competency is not just knowledge and it's not just attitudes. It's like a rope that has many different threads that need to be braided. So we know from studies of how people learn other subjects, say math, that the attitude that people have about whether they can do math is incredibly important. And in some schools and in some education systems, some students, sometimes girls, get the notion that I can't do math. And that mindset is incredibly consequential because it causes people to not try, to not challenge themselves. So extrapolate that to climate. If the conclusion that students get is, this is terribly complicated, this is overwhelming, I cannot understand this, there is nothing that I can do, it's going to have the same self-fulfilling quality than the belief I can't do math. And so working on that notion of self-efficacy is important. But of course, it's not about making people believe things that are not true. It's about building that alongside real knowledge and real skills. In the book, we cite the work of a scholar, Maria Ojala, who has spent a lot of her career studying, on the one hand, the emotions of climate, as the emotions that people have about climate as one of the threads in that braid, in that rope, which are very important. And so she's done experiments of this sort. She would take a group of high school students and assign them to two very different conditions. One group would just take a one-semester course on climate science. Another group will take the same course, but will also engage in some kind of an action activity. And she will then evaluate before and after knowledge, but also the disposition to act on that knowledge, self-efficacy. And what does she find? That both groups learn the knowledge just as well. But the students in the first group are unchanged at best and may even feel less efficacious at the end of the course than at the beginning. Sort of like a little bit of knowledge actually doesn't make you believe that you can do something about it. It makes you believe that this is all too complicated. But the second group gains the same levels of knowledge, but also gains the confidence that they can act on what they know to do something about the problem. So I think that what good education is in this domain, as in many others, it's not a singular thing. It's about thinking about the range of capacities that we need to develop and the kinds of pedagogies that Faith has described so well that help teachers from different subjects come together. I think, unfortunately, we're living at a time where in many education systems, at a systems level, leaders have concluded that the challenges are so immense that they have to focus on very small goals. And so you hear all these emphases on foundational literacy, basically teaching people to read at the earliest levels, which is, of course, incredibly important, but also hugely insufficient to prepare anybody in the world in which they live to understand that world, let alone to become architects of their own lives. And I think that one of the challenges that we're trying to address with this book is to tell people, this is not either or. We don't need to bring a mindset of scarcity to education systems and to say, because they are failing in so many ways, let's just do one thing. Let's just teach people to sound out words and maybe to increase the speed with which they can read things. That's important, sure, but it reflects a very poor sense of what is it that especially poor children need to learn in order to become self-authoring individuals in a very complex world. And good education will always be about the kinds of examples that Faith and Margaret are giving us. And it is possible to do that in many environments. Part of what we need to begin is with leaders who have the complexity of mind and the depth of understanding to figure out how do you leverage these systems, which are, yes, complex education systems, but also very capacious to deliver good education and not reduce them to deliver an education that at the end of the day is not really worth much for anybody.
Spot on, spot on. I think I'll just emphasize something you've mentioned there, Fernando, the fact that climate is a system, right? It's so interrelated, and we're inviting people to think at a level that otherwise might not feel, pedestrian to them, which is what is likely to be achieved. We're asking people to begin to join the dots for themselves, and the role of education is to help people see the patterns of actions that lead to the systemic results that we see in the world today. A phrase that I use often is the fact that hope springs from action, right? We want hope, but hope doesn't happen by chance. Hope comes through action. And so I'm encouraging people to feel that change is possible if we act in a systemic manner, rather than believe that this is a doomed cause, there's nothing you can do about it. You have doomsayers on one side and you have the ultra optimists on the other side. Again, we got to keep coming towards the center to recognize that there are actions that are making a difference, and it's possible to achieve scale in those actions if you can join the dots and see how all these things relate. Within our own world as an educational movement, we recognized a little bit that we had varying levels of resourcing across our schools and being able to track their own climate footprint, environmental footprint. And we're privileged with the support of a philanthropist to be able to create a baseline understanding across all of our schools. We said, let's track the things that we can all track a bit easily to begin this journey together. How much do you consume electricity on a monthly basis? And can you track that over the course of a year and then benchmark that against similar sized organizations or other schools in your country to give you a sense of how well or not well you are doing in terms of energy consumption? doing the same thing with water consumption, doing the same thing with building efficiency and food waste, etc. And the moment people begin to see the data, the sparks begin to go off in their brains. Someone said, well, how come we consume that much electricity? I didn't think we were that bad, right? What can we do? But without the visibility of that information in a contained system, people didn't feel any kind of agency or responsibility for doing things differently. But the hope began to spring from taking that first action. Think, hey, we can do better. We can lower our own footprint. We can inspire others as well. The moment visibility felt personal, felt direct. But if you show me national data of how much we are consuming as a nation, it doesn't feel personal. I don't know what I can do about that. But the moment we brought it close enough to a single institution, a single household in this case, it felt more tangible, realistic, and people wanted to begin to lower their own footprint. We're still on that journey, but it's the invitation for us to think about how can I measure my own actions, and are there tools out there that make me want to do something differently? Because I can see that by doing that, if we all do that, all of a sudden the trend begins to turn. So my encouragement here for people is to think about personal action. Don't discount it. The more personal it feels, the more encouraged you are to get on this journey as a whole.
Thank you so much, Faith. And I wanted to move us to the question of systems change. And Fernando, I'm going to point this to you as a professor who really looks at the education system as a whole. There were so many questions about, okay, this is great on what we can do in the classroom, but how do we move that from isolated projects to system-wide mainstream climate education? Even questions that were saying, well, okay, what do governments have to do? How does curriculum standards have to change? And I know that in this second section, we talked a little bit about how to teach about climate change. And I want to point out that chapter 5 also has really great case studies of 39 schools all over different countries doing amazing things, but how do we take that from one classroom, one scenario to something that's system-wide? So Fernando, chapter 7 is really about policy. And it argues that climate education keeps failing, not because of bad intentions, but because of the systems. Can you explain this low climate learning trap system and then the levers that must move together in order for us to make those systemic changes?
Yeah. So let me begin with learning and with instruction in the classroom. Good learning is the product of a system, and good teaching is a result of a system. Now, what are the components of that system? What the teacher knows, what the teacher believes they should do, the supports that the teachers have to teach adequately, instructional resources, space, the time that they have to teach, the expectations that the institution has for what students will learn and teachers will do, the kind of accountability structures that both students and teachers face, what peers, the kinds of peer pressures that teachers experience. All of these is beginning to shape a system. Someone once described good teaching as like baking a cake. You need a range of ingredients in the right proportions at the right time at the right temperature. So that's a description of a system. Now you begin to map outwards from that classroom into the school, into the network that the school is a part, or the school district, into the state or the nation, and you see other elements of the system. What are they? At a macro level, you have the curriculum, what nations believe students should learn, and when they should learn it. You then have the kinds of teachers and the preparation they have to teach that. One of the things that we document in the book is that the knowledge that teachers themselves have about climate is woefully limited. So how can you teach what you don't understand yourself? You then have assessments, very, very important. Assessments in many places drive instruction because we have attached to them consequences for students and for teachers that basically cause them and their parents to focus more on the assessment than on the curriculum. But then you have the very organization of schools. In order for schools to do what Faith is describing, this wonderful collaboration across teachers who are all from different disciplines, helping students understand systems, you need a lot of coordination. You need time for joint planning. You need trust among those teachers so that you need time to communicate so they can orchestrate that production. So what happens is if you take the existing level of education in a school, in a classroom, in a system at a point, it reflects an equilibrium of the system that is in place. And transforming instruction is not about coming with an edict and saying, okay, now we're going to teach this subject. It's about understanding what are the drivers, what is beneath the water in that iceberg that is keeping that equilibrium in place, and what needs to change so you change the system. So, an obvious example, it would be of little use to say, well, let's add a unit on climate change in a system and hope that this would produce great changes if you don't change anything else. Start with the obvious. If you don't offer preparation for teachers to have the knowledge and to feel confident that they can teach this, what do you think they're going to do? No matter what the curriculum drives them to do. But even if you offer preparation and you don't change the expectations of the knowledge that has to be covered. This is one of the challenges with some curricula. We all say that we want deeper learning and that less is more, but then we assess students on knowing a lot of facts at the end of a level of instruction or a grade. So who in their right mind is going to pause and slow down to allow deeper learning when they know that their students are going to be assessed with instruments that measure low order cognitive skills and short term recall? Most people will drive to that because that is what is going to matter to the students or to the schools themselves. So I think that what we do in the book is we offer a framework to recognize what are the drivers of that system and how do we produce changes. Now, to your question, Margaret, what do we need to do to change it? The first thing we need to do is to see the system. You cannot understand what you can't see. You cannot change what you don't see or you don't understand. And what we're trying to do in the book is to name and say, look, these are the drivers of a system: curriculum, teacher preparation and support, assessment, organization of the schools, even governance of the system, the accountability structures that exist. And if we're going to produce changes that get everybody to understand climate change deeply, those are the levers that we need to transform. And the reason this notion of collective leadership that both you and Faith have been talking about is so important is because education systems, this is certainly true for national education systems, but it may also be true for smaller network systems like the United World College. They involve a lot of people. They really are like an orchestra or multiple orchestras at the same time. And if different people see different portions of the system. You know, it's the proverbial person looking at an elephant through a little hole in a tent. Some people see the tail of the elephant, some people see the trunk, some people. But what we need is an opportunity for people to see the entire elephant, to see what others see. And I think that requires certainly frameworks that can help you see that, but also communication, mechanisms of communication, and conditions that allow psychological safety for people to really collaborate, to put themselves in the shoes of others and to work together to transform the system. So our hope is that our book, in offering this systemic conception of how education and climate relate, is going to provide a language, is going to provide mental models that can help people move away from these mindsets of scarcity that basically assume that education systems are factories that produce widgets. And because they have shown poor results, we should just try to produce fewer widgets. And I think that industrial model, that industrial factory model, is fundamentally the wrong mindset to understand an education system. And it is the cause, not the solution, of the problems that our education systems face. So we're trying to offer a different way to think about education.
Well, thank you so much, Fernando, for that. And I also wanted to ask a bit because there was a lot of questions about like okay, what levers to pull, and you talk about 5 levers. If you could quickly go over that, and then I'll
Yeah.
invite.
So curriculum, you don't mean the 5 frames, but you mean the actual levers, right? Of the system. Curriculum, assessment and accountability structure, the teacher education and ongoing professional support, school leadership, and then the governance of the school. If you're going to produce change, you need to shift all those things in a similar direction. You can't just shift some of them. And of course, the challenge is that very often authority to produce those changes is distributed. That's why collaboration, that's why collective leadership is so necessary, so that those who are responsible for those various levers can move them in synchrony, in harmony, towards a direction that supports better and deeper climate change education.
Right. And I just want to comment that we talk a lot about the formal networks and formal systems, but we do have a chapter that talks about how powerful informal networks are too, and that infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean government policy, but there are also already so many informal networks of educators who are sharing resources, co-developing best practices, and building expertise. And this is what, a niche reform that Meta and Cohen talk about. We also even talk about international networks. And I want to bring it to Faith for a last comment on that, because we talk about how these informal networks can really help inform government and policies and systems. So I was wondering, Faith, is that, we see UWC and hearing you talk about everything that you're doing. It's such a great example of a niche reform, a network that is held together by a shared mission, not a government mandate. And then you all are implementing this microcosm like effective climate education. What do you think that this can offer to the broader system that maybe government-led reform cannot? And how can what you do in UWC help impact government systems and what Fernando was talking about and what everybody in this webinar kept on asking about? How do we make this a systems-wide change?
Yeah. Think this is a fantastic question and great to be able to see the spectrum of interventions that have to come together for us to feel the difference that's been made. Someone's asking in the chat earlier in the Q&A about just teacher preparation as a thing. And I think we feel very privileged to have the spaces to experiment, to create pilots, to incubate solutions, to track footprint, to be able to record data, to invite students to look at dashboards and really see their own actions. This is not the case in the vast majority of schools around the world. So I think the question of what you do with privilege is how you extend it in service of others. And so I feel very responsible for the space in which we exist to do the work well and then show the evidence of how it has worked in our context and then begin to invite others to think about how they can domesticate, similar or at least, related methodologies in their own contexts. I think for many teachers, one of the gaps is their own sense of personal agency. When you have so much of life happening to you, where do you find the space to be hopeful about the climate agenda, whether as part of a broader curriculum or as a standalone subject? Within the International Baccalaureate, a course was created again largely out of United World Colleges called, the Environmental Systems and Societies. So a course that began to create more of this interdisciplinary approach to understanding the various interventions or levers that create our reality of the climate. So in creating space for people to be able to build understanding across disciplines and then to find ways in which they can practice something that gives them that sense of agency, I think is the beginnings of what we can do. Now, in our network, what we are seeing as the ripples that create hope is actually seeing how students themselves are relating to what we are creating. Everyone is observing how young people come into the classroom eager to participate in managing a green farm or in managing the mangrove reforestation or the rainforest preservation that we do in different parts of the world. Just having the space to help people actually see what is working begins to stimulate future actions. I think a lot of what we are creating right now will be open source or can be open source. And that is a lot of my hope that if we do this work well, we are then a bit of an incubator of what is possible in the rest of education. We are disseminating most of our learnings within this network of international baccalaureate schools, which we helped to co-create nearly 6 decades ago. And now you have 6,000 just under schools around the world that all deliver the international baccalaureate programs. We take our responsibility quite seriously in this space to develop curriculums, train teachers, and then invite others to learn from us. So I think there's a lot more we can do in this space. We're also hosting webinars similar to this to keep disseminating knowledge, bringing in practitioners and teachers from our spaces for others to see and just get that sense of possibility within this educational field. Let's make this an open invitation for anyone out there who's listening to this webinar in real time or listening to this later, who would like to get a little bit closer to some of the evidence of what we do. I'd say it's an open door for us. I want us to be more in a position. We've actually built a website called UWC Sustainability, in which we're showcasing a bit more to the world. I'll put a link again in the chat for people to actually see across our different schools. This is not perfect by any means, right? But it's a chance to be doing this in the public limelight, so that I think the more we build a sense of coalition around the work that we're doing, the more people feel like, it's not impossible for me to start. If you look at us and think we're perfect, I think it probably diminishes, desires from other schools to think, well, maybe I can also do something. If there's a teacher out there who's feeling very overwhelmed because they can't quite find the space in their classroom, there's likely an equivalent teacher on our side of the world who's thinking, well, here's where I began, and maybe I can share some of those methodologies. And for school systems that want to get on this journey as well, we'll be happy to share our methodologies in how we've been tracking our footprint, in how we're engaging with local communities, in how we're teaching in the classroom. Even a small permaculture farm that you build on a little patch of land can become the beginnings of engagement. We don't all have to wait for government policy. That is beyond most of us. But the actions we can take in our local communities can ripple out. And now you have network of schools in the community who can begin to build farms together and get young people getting their hands dirty. You will be amazed how in 5 to 20 years, those same young people become the practitioners that make a difference at many levels. So it's a huge honor to have this leadership role as which we have given ourselves to do something for the world of education, and then for others to learn from us, share with us what they're doing as well. I'll invite people to be in touch with me in ways that are possible, and we'll signpost people towards where they can find the most proximal space for something like what I'm talking about. But I'm really grateful to have a chance to share and for others to get inspired by this little evidence of what's possible.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm keeping an eye on time, and I want to move to the Q&A section. We've been very efficient in answering all the Q&A that has come through the Q&A function. And we've also been pretty good at answering the questions that have come through the webinar. If I'm not mistaken, we probably answered all of them. But if there are still questions that you have, feel free to either write it in the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to read out one of the questions that still remain. There's a question by Emanuela. How to approximate the governmental climate education policies to what happens in the school? How can schools implement coherent educational priorities when governments often promote multiple, oftentimes competing policy agendas simultaneously? So that is a question that still remains. I've invited Fernando, Faith, to feel free to answer that, because I know, Fernando, you talked a little bit about this competing priorities and how, yeah.
Let me do a +1 to Faith's comments on the power of networks, because it seems to me that when we think about the question of change, we rightly recognize the importance of government and government policies, essentially hierarchical organizations. But I think we underestimate the power of more horizontal networks. I think the example Faith gave of how that idea that Kurt Hand had and had the opportunity to test in the United World Colleges in Wales really had tremendous lasting impact. Who would have thought that 70 years later, This would now be not only a range of institutions with hundreds of thousands of graduates around the world, but also became the laboratory of the IB, which then became its own thing and extended into others. And I think that in our day and age, the tools that we have at our disposal, the communication tools, are so much more powerful than what the United World College had at inception. So Faith said, we've created a website. It's not perfect, but here's our contribution. That's a great example. Just looking at good practice at the moment and taking the time to analyze good practice at the moment. In the book, the chapter that examines the power of networks and also the chapter that examines good practice does one thing, which is to look at one network created by a relatively recent organization, T4 Education, which is an observatory. It's an observatory of good educational practice, and it works through a system of annual prizes. Schools around the world are invited to submit innovations they're engaged in 4 or 5 domains, including sustainability education. And then the organization makes visible. But in that process, all the entries become an incredible repository of knowledge. And what we did is we talked to the leader of that organization, Vikas Pota. He said, by all means, you can use that body of knowledge, and we analyze it. And it turns out we found that knowledge as useful as some of the knowledge coming from international organizations with many more resources and much more pedigree than these relatively small homegrown organizations. So that's a great example of how ordinary people and organizations, and even small organizations, can have enormous power, enormous influence. Now, of course, networks work in interaction with governments. It is one thing to be an organization like Subject to Climate in a context in which government is supportive of climate education, and it's an entirely different thing to be subject to climate in a context where government is trying to suppress climate change education. Subject to Climate can still do good work in both contexts, but it is going to be different. In one case, it is going to amplify, it is going to complement government's efforts. There are going to be synergies between what um, civil society organizations do and government intends. In another context, it's going to supplement what the government is doing. And sometimes, in some contexts, we'll have to do that very cautiously. We'll have to take Hungary, for example, as a recent case of a country where government was actually not supportive at all to efforts to teach about climate change education or global citizenship education more generally. There were still organizations of civil society, both national and transnational, but they had to work a little bit under the radar. They had to be careful because governments are powerful. So I just want to underscore that theme that Faith mentioned on how important it is for everybody to do what they can and to build. And I think I love to hear you talking about we are a movement. We are a global movement for education. I haven't heard many people in the UWC community use that term before, and I think you rightly have the potential to be. I would say you have the potential of being a global movement more than the reality. But I think it's important to have that aspiration and to stress that in what you do that can inspire others, and then refine your theory of action of how it is that in effect you're going to have an influence that will go way beyond the schools that are formally part of the actual network of schools.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Fernando. I think what we're seeing here, to the point you made earlier as well about just finding networks that make a difference. I just shared in the link about Villa Institute. This is based in Switzerland, and I've been to their annual symposium. It's a gathering of academics and practitioners at all levels. The more we showcase the kinds of spaces in which the real solutions are happening. And when I went to the conference, you got a bunch of students there, high school level, university level, you got professors at various levels. Some of their work is visible online as well. So it's an invitation for people to see where else this kind of work is happening in a way that makes a difference. And someone was asking about, gamified approaches to teaching this. They do an annual showcase of various ways in which schools are delivering climate-based education. So I recommend having a look at them. At another level, the Zayed Sustainability Prize, which is hosted by the government of the UAE, is another space in which people can see collections, like what you talked about with T4 that Vikas put together. Every year you have high schools and I believe universities, I might be mistaken on that level, but at least high schools showcasing student-led projects that contribute towards, a more sustainable future. They all apply regionally, and they do an annual prize, but then they document some of the winners of their prize on their website. So you can look at different examples of what school-based actions look like. Several UWC schools have won the prize for their region and all that. But I also worked prior to this at a place called African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, very, very focused on climate action as well. And one of the projects that won the Zayed Sustainability Prize for Africa, I think this was back in 2018 or thereabouts, was really about building something called the Living Machine. You take wastewater from bathrooms, kitchen, etc. You recycle that on campus. You turn it back into the environment. So circularity becomes a way in which inspiration happens, and this is led by students with teachers. The more we showcase these examples, the more it feels normal, in education to be involved in climate action. I want people to feel hopeful because there are many of us who are doing this together. If you think you're walking alone, you feel a bit less hopeful. But when you look around, you realize we're all in this together. I think the hope springs from our various actions. So I want to just emphasize networks, shared visibility of what's working around you. And I'm, again, happy for us to be more of these kinds of organizations that help people to see what's possible. And I hope we can do much more of this.
And I know that there are more comments and questions, but I'm also looking at time. I think, Faith, for you, there's one question from Roger, and I think I know you, Roger. So hello, for you to maybe on the side talk to him if there's a potential collaboration with UWC, and to comment on just one last comment on what Fernando and Faith have been saying. So like there's the power of informal networks. And so when you ask the question, how do schools implement when government has multiple policy agendas? Well, climate change is so interdisciplinary. We believe at Subject to Climate that you can actually integrate it with all the agendas that are already there. So that's why we have resources that are on math, if you're focused on math literacy, resources on reading, if the government is focused on literacy in general. It's an interdisciplinary topic. I believe that it can be woven into the priorities that already exist. So Fernando, I guess I would pass it to you to close us off, and I'll put some links in the chat as well.
I just want to thank you and Faith, not only for this wonderful conversation this morning, but for your good leadership in your own respective organizations, doing good work. And I want to thank those of you who joined us today and those of you who will view this recording subsequently. I completely agree that in spite of all the challenges of climate change and others, there is good work going on in schools around the world every day. And the more we can see and learn from that work and connect those who are doing that work, the more we will grow hope based not on naive ideas that the world can be better, but on the certainty that, as Margaret Mead said, there is no challenge that a small group of committed people cannot address. In fact, nothing worthwhile has ever been achieved any other way. So with that, I encourage you all to read our book. It's an open access book. I hope you'll find it useful, pass it on to others, and share the link of this recording to others. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.
This was terrific. Thank you very much.